I'm Cheryl Viirand, and I'm the head of school at Cajal Academy. And with us here today, we have Heather Edwards, who is my co-founder and our occupational therapist, who is so much more. Because really, this whole program came out of some of the innovative ways that Heather has been working with and expanding on the occupational therapy toolbox. Also with us today is Dr. Steven Mattis, who is an internationally recognized neuropsychologist who has been recognized as one of the founding fathers of neuropsychology in the United States. He has over 70 peer-reviewed journal articles to his name. And if you ask the kids who've had the chance to work with him, he's also right good fun and is absolutely not above sitting down barefoot on an OT mat and playing a board game or whatever else it takes to help a child feel at home. Um, it is really an extreme pleasure for me to have the opportunity to present today's conversation together with this, I think, pretty extraordinary team. Um, we This is really something that's incredibly close to my heart. I am, in addition to being co-founder of Cajal, I came to that as a mom of two twice exceptional kids, daughter of two twice exceptional parents, sister of a twice exceptional brother. So this is kind of a community that I've never not known. And one of the things that I learned as mom to two kids who have fairly complex medical profiles is that there really is a lack of understanding out there, and took a very long time for me to come to understand this myself with the help of Heather Edwards and Dr. Mattis. Ram it into my head Saturday mornings in the gym and over the phone, etc., to understand the ways that what was happening inside their bodies was not just the first part of a report, and then you go on to talk about the neuropsychological profile. It was something that infuses every experience of their every moment. And that resonated with me in part because I have my own complex hidden differences. And that what we then did together as a team is to start to work towards some new processes and approaches that can take that complicated information and research that a lot of these are new discoveries happening every day or every year. But then there's a whole lot that's actually really well established by now, and trying to turn that into new educational approaches to help kids. So let's see, I'm sure that we're going to continue to get notifications that we have more people in our waiting room. But let's go ahead and plunge in here. So I guess I've just covered this content right here. Really, we couldn't find another school that was focusing in on this science and bringing this science together. The three of us are just the beginning of the team, though. We have a much broader team that's already in place working with kids. Because of COVID, we ended up extending our pilot program for longer. We've been remote this year because some of the complications that led us to found the school in the first place on the health side. But as you can see, we have actually at this point, I think we're up to 5 licensed therapists, one of whom is right now in a school building and is donning her mask. And we also have 4 highly experienced educators who have a real passion for working with these kids. Really, where we started from was creating a custom pilot program for my younger child, who's now 10. And Heather and I started that work together. And as we took down all the silos and then started digging into what do we know, we kept thinking to ourselves, well, if we're starting from scratch, then why would we start with traditional assumptions about school? Why don't we instead start with modern research about kids? And really what we understood is that there has been just a sea change in understandings about how children and adults learn, socialize, develop, and grow over the last 20 years or so. That's largely because of the development of the functional MRI machine. And yet that science still has not made it into classrooms where it can really help kids. So They keep telling me that we can't change everything in a day. Fine. But my feeling as mom is that we have a moral imperative to be leveraging all available science to help kids. And the more complex the challenges that the child is up against, the more compelling it is for us to be reaching into every corner of what we know today. What we know today is an awful lot more on the science side, but additionally, we have all of these new strategies that have been developed in therapeutic settings that can be used to apply that science in real world changes for kids. So today, we're just going to talk about one of the many ways that that flows through our program. But as you can see from this slide here, there are 5 major areas of scientific advance that we're already implementing in our school program. And that will continue as we develop our school and our cohort. We will be continuing to add more elements in. So we are a nonprofit, and we founded ourselves in 2019 as a nonprofit because we realized that in order to run the school we wanted to run for twice exceptional kids, we needed to have these neuroscience-based innovations. And in order to create those innovations, we needed a flagship school. We simply couldn't find other programs that were doing these things yet. So if anybody's interested in finding out more about whether Cajal Academy would be a good fit for your child, please feel free to reach out to me or hang out at the end, and we can talk more about our program if folks are interested. But for reasons that you'll see as we go through our program today, our school is specifically for kids who have very high fluid and or verbal reasoning skills. And you'll see that that's essential to exactly the protocols that we're here to talk about today. So with that, I'm excited to turn this over to Dr. Steven Mattis. It is really such a privilege to have him here with us today. And in our school, he's directly working with the kids many hours a week and is incredibly instrumental in helping us develop this program. So Dr. Mattis, can you start please by, I should say, Dr. Mattis has been a professor at 3 of the world's top medical schools. He has a tendency to fall into being a professor. So he and I have a deal that when that starts to happen, I will pull him back down to earth again so we can all make sure that we stay engaged in the conversation. All right, so with that, what are neurophysiologic experiences and what is this whole thing about?
Okay, we are at a great luck at this point because our technology allows us to actually map neurophysiologic experiences as they affect brain through fMRI and other techniques of that sort. What we are learning is that these neurophysiologic experiences are a significant input to our thinking, our feelings, and our behavior, much of which is not particularly conscious at the time. So what we have is a series of experiences that we have of our body, and we use this in order to get a sense of what's going on in the world, how we feel about it, and what we might do next. What the subtlety of the more obvious is if we're experiencing pain. And as we're experiencing pain, we get pulled away from whatever it is we're looking at. And in fact, we do not have available that level of critical thinking that is necessary for complex problem solving, because most of brain is devoted to keeping us from feeling the pain or doing something adaptive to offset the pain. But more subtly, there's an experiment, for example, in which an individual, a subject, talks to a number of people, gets involved in some transaction, and then reports back to the experimenter as to what did he think about the people, what did he think about their competence, what did they like. And the difference is that half of the subjects were carrying a warm stone, and the other half were carrying a cold stone. And that was the whole thing. Those who were carrying a warm stone felt that all the people they met were really pleasant. The people they spoke to were quite expert and competent. And overall, they had a pretty good time. Those holding a cold stone felt that they weren't quite in touch with the people they were talking. They seemed kind of distant. They weren't quite sure about the competence of the people that they had been speaking with. And they had a so-so experience, but it wasn't anything they would write home about. That manner in which you can essentially assess complex problem solving and feelings and social judgments on the basis of mild differences in sensory function was in fact a powerful example of just how much physiologic experiences frame our thoughts and feelings. In the kinds of activities that we have, when we are bombarded with stimuli, we fall into one of two categories when we think. The first, it has major survival value, and that's our emergency function. That's fight, flight, and freeze. It's also forage and fornicate, but that's extra. But those are our emergency survival behaviors. When we're involved in those behaviors, what we cannot do is, if we have the next slide. Okay. What we cannot do is reason. We have this immediate danger in front of us. And what we have for survival is behavior that is supposed to keep us from dying. That has primary priority over anything else that we are thinking about. And so when we are in this mode, blood, neuronal attention goes to those parts of the body that are necessary for fighting or fleeing. But that part of the brain that is reasonable, that allows us to think, have good social decisions, be able to do math, problem solve, follow directions, and explain what you're doing, is not available. So as you are running from this bear, you are looking for a path out, a tree to climb. What you're not being able to do is turn around to the bear and say, listen, we can work this out. I'll have the berries, you can have the meat. Well, maybe we can talk about that. That doesn't happen. You're not in that mode. And in fact, you cannot reach that level of reasoning when you're in survival mode. So when you're in this survival mode, you cannot be taught complex academic subjects because you just do not have available that level of critical thinking to assimilate and work with that information. So these physiologic events that we experience can have the same effect as these danger survival experiences. And what we have.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Steve. This is where Heather Edwards is going to jump in here and give an example of exactly what Dr. Mattis was just speaking about, that a lot of us may be familiar with from our own children or from classroom environments. So Heather, can you give us just an example of how this plays out, for instance, for a child with sensory processing disorder?
So many of our kids have sensory processing disorders, and they all look very different depending on the child. But to go along with what Dr. Mattis is saying, one example is if a car honks and you have an auditory processing, and that is an auditory trigger, your child may throw himself to the floor, throw a book in his hand, or all of a sudden get grouchy and you don't have no idea. So these kids can melt down, throw a fit, or they can just shut down, become really quiet. Maybe they're just not responding. And we have no idea because we didn't even hear the car in the parking lot honk because we're so focused on what we're doing. The same thing can happen when a kid is in the classroom and a child accidentally brushes up against them. that light touch can be felt as pain. And so then they go into that, fight or flight, they get that startle reflex. And the same things will happen. They go into that disorganized thought. They can't process what's going on. And so it may look like avoidance or, they're just not doing what they're supposed to be doing in class, but when really they're just disorganized in that survival state and trying hard to reorganize their body to come back to what they're supposed to be doing.
Perfectly succinctly said. So there's a whole range of different internal hidden physiologic experiences that could put a child into that state. Before I turn it back over to Dr. Mattis, he and I agreed that I would present this small piece right here because it took about 8 hours for him to explain it to me. So we sort of brought it down into one sort of hopefully more user-friendly slide. So to vastly oversimplify this and spare the rest of you the 8 hours, although it was lovely. In essence, within a child's body or an adult's body, there are a whole bunch of different regulatory systems that happen at once. So I know for me as a mom, everybody kept talking about whether my child was regulated or not, or we're going to re-regulate your child and send him back to class. What did that mean, really? And what I eventually came to understand from Dr. Mattis and folks in the medical field is that in essence, I've got 4 axes here, but there are a whole lot more than this. Everything from regulating your core body temperature, making sure you don't get overly too hot or overly too cold, to the sensory integration we just spoke about, immune system responses, things like mast cell activation syndrome or PANDAS or Lyme's, differences in your immune system, distribution of blood flow, your neurovascular system and how that functions. With respect to each of these, it's not as simple as, too much is a bad thing. So you see these 3 dials at the top of my little faux control board, anxiety, depression, agitation. We can all understand, like, if you get too much anxiety, that's clearly a bad thing. If you get too much depression, that's clearly a bad thing. So it's sort of, monodirectional. If we go up into the red, that's bad. But with something like, let's use the example of core body temperature. This is actually an area where Dr. Mattis has done a lot of original research and quite frankly, changed my son's life. For some people and for some kids, we all have an outer bound of safe. And it's not just, I can't let my body get too hot to where I'm overheated, but it's also, I can't get so cold that I end up with hypothermia, right? The issue is if those markers at which the body cues you to make some corrective action in response to the environmental change is too far apart. So what we want is that if you look at my little control board here, your slider should stay in the green. And if your parameters are set too far apart, before you trip that, oh, wait, I should go put on a sweater, or, oh, wait, I should turn on a fan, then you can end up in those red zones, which within the body is itself a state of danger. And I think, in fact, Dr. Mattis, turning this back over to you, I think the term that you've used for this is an existential threat happening within the child's own body. From the outside, as mom, as teacher, as coach, what we might see is, oh my goodness, this child just totally overreacted. So turning it back over to you, Dr. Mattis, how do you look at those events in terms of understanding the child's response?
Well, when your system is not within the bounds of balance that each of the systems have, that balance is there for a existential purpose. We have been developed over time a certain body range, a temperature range, a certain level of sensory integration, and that's optimum for us. And when it gets too high or too low, then our body acts as if, because actually it is, in danger and of the collapse either of other organs and so forth. And so while that temperature raise may not be in reality a danger, but from the child's inner experience, that is responded to as if it's an existential crisis. And what the child does is adaptive, not to the situation, but to his own inner experiences that demand that the individual do something to keep his system in homeostasis, in balance. And so the individual will do something that's quite adaptive to his inner experience, but looks terribly inappropriate given the setting that other people see. The kinds of issues that give these kinds of irregular idiosyncratic experiences are things like pain, chronic fatigue syndrome, the kind of dysautonomia that one can see with the mast cell activation. I don't want to read these for you, but we have a series of disorders that affect our children that are never really taken into account in the academic setting, hidden from the observer. And they are, however, not hidden from the child, because he's experiencing this all the time, except he may not have been taught how to identify the pain or identify the system that's out of whack, and therefore be able to adapt in a more socially appropriate manner. So in our own kind of, the behavior that we can observe is tend most of the time to be goal-oriented. I want to do something and you do it. Often it's neurophysiologically driven, as I mentioned before. And there's also another construct, and that's trauma. Our children have experienced multiple trauma in their school. They have failed, they have been sometimes ostracized, bullied, and the result is very similar to any other kinds of specific trauma, and that is you respond with fear and you are hyper alert to the probability of danger in your environment. It makes the children overly sensitive to interpret even neutral experiences as dangerous, as degrading, as humiliating. And so you get a response to the environment that is not appropriate to what was actually said or done, but is in fact a function of the patient's fear and need to avoid danger and failure.
So if I can just jump in here very, very briefly, one of the things that is really striking, if you, we started from a sort of a cohort base of twice exceptional children. And it's very striking if you look at the literature around twice exceptional kids, or you look at other schools that cater to twice exceptional kids, you'll typically see a list of characteristics. You'll note we don't do it that way in our admissions process or on our website, but if you look at those lists of characteristics, you will almost always see a description of a child who is, they might call them obstinate, or they might call them defiant, or doesn't want to do non-preferred tasks. All of these are sort of descriptions of a child who, as Dr. Mattis explained to me, just has hypervigilance to failure because they've had a number of negative experiences. Now, happily, not every child does go through this in school. That is awesome. And the goal is to be working towards an understanding as educators to where no child goes through that in school. Needless to say, that is every educator's goal. The unfortunate reality is that a large percentage of kids who have very complex learning profiles, in particular where they have both an outlying area of strength coupled with an outlying area of weakness, which is really the classic twice exceptional profile, that for these kids, they are ending up in that place more often than not because there's more going on. And so a lot of what you're going to be hearing at the on the last third of our presentation today is the new system that we've developed specifically focusing on this problem set. So appreciating that most of the sort of behavior management techniques, if you will, start from the premise of goal-oriented behavior. But what happens when it's not? What happens when that's not the reality that's driving it? So with that, let's look at how existing behavioral approaches do line up with the science that Dr. Mattis was just explaining to us about how hidden neurophysiologic events can impact children's learning, social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. So we're going to go through kind of the three biggies that are dominant within educational environments today. And then we'll explain the work that we're doing towards developing a new approach, putting on the table that brings into account this neurophysiological underpinnings. So starting with the sort of the 800-pound gorilla, starting with the most common today in educational settings, which is ABA therapy. So Dr. Mattis, in a brief nutshell, can you just give us a quick overview of like, what are the primary assumptions behind this approach? And then we'll go from there.
The primary assumption is that behaviors can be altered when you alter the consequences for that behavior. And the primary literature is learning theory, is very well documented. And it assumes that the behavior has a specific goal. You want to change that behavior to reach that goal. And so you do that by rewarding behavior that approaches your specific goal and either negatively reward or ignore that behavior that is not in the direction that you want. And this is done with giving stars or giving rewards or praise and so forth. One does this by studying the child. You're looking for what are the antecedents of his behavior. And the assumption is that which occurs before this behavior is causal to that behavior. And if you have consequences for that behavior, you can then change it when you recognize the situation that triggers it. And then you can alter the behavior in the direction that you wish through the guidelines of a well-documented learning theory and reward. The problem is when the child's behavior is not a function of what occurred just before, but is a function of some intervening event which is hidden. And when that happens, what you have is a behavior that's adaptive to the physiologic experience, but not to the situation necessarily, and actually looks like an overreaction to the situation. Altering the reward on the basis of the behavior essentially teaches the child that if he's not experiencing this internal event, then he's behaving appropriately, and that's good. But when he has this event, he's punished for it, and this event that he experiences is seen as a negative experience. It is requiring the child essentially to do something he can't do. When there's this when you get an inner pain, you do something about it. And if you're punished for that, then all you have is the experience of frustration of being asked to do something that in fact is not within your skill set. And you experience essentially failure. You're asking the child to do something, engage in a task that's actually beyond their ability.
And if I can, sorry, just to jump in there, it's beyond their ability in that moment. And to give an example that might resonate for families where there are, for instance, chronic medical conditions that have variable impacts, conditions I'm thinking of, such as, for instance, immunological disorders like, again, mast cell activation syndrome or Lyme's or PANDAS, that when those, when the child's symptoms are in a flare, or when their immune system, for instance, is in a reactive state where they have all these neurochemical changes happening in their body as that are driven by that hidden immunological event, it may the child's body is no longer prioritizing the classroom rules or figuring out what Susie just said and how I should most properly respond to that, right? So if the child is in a situation where they're being, given a gold star every time they achieve goal XYZ that relates to, for instance, following classroom rules, then it may turn out that the child consistently gets those gold stars on the days when they are not in symptom flares. But on those days when they are, those gold stars are withheld because they are not following classroom rules. So if we're just looking at that sort of output oriented, did you achieve the mark or did you not, then it fails to take into account, it just doesn't, it's not in any intent on anybody's part, but it ends up not taking into account the fact that the child may actually be working the hardest on those days when they are in that flare. And so instead of rewarding that effort, the child ends up walking away with an understanding that their medical difference makes them bad or makes them not fit or unsuccessful. And that is obviously not the message that anybody intended to send. So then the child can walk away feeling shame for those differences, and that can hamper their appetite to ask for help and to self-advocate. And it also obviously has a whole bunch of other very challenging impacts as the child grows in terms of their identity. With that, I think we'll pop over to Cbt Dbt, if that's all right with you, Dr. Mattis.
Yes.
Let's go through a sort of a similar sort of outline, if you will.
Okay. CBT and is essentially another learning theory. This is cognitive behavioral therapy, in which the cognition is a major part of the intervention. Where the ABA, it's mostly the behavior you're looking at. In cognitive behavioral and dialectic behavioral therapy, how the patient thinks about what's going on is the focus of attention. And the data for treatment is very strong for cognitive behavioral therapy of anxiety and depression. DBT is used and was developed mostly to treat patients who have suicidal behavior, very frequent suicidal gestures, and has been also taken up in working with patients with addiction. In this model, you have a triggering situation, and that situation triggers negative thoughts, inappropriate feelings, or images. And these negative thoughts and images then lead to aberrant behavior. And the focus of the treatment is to essentially reframe the reactive negative thoughts and feelings, the inappropriate negative thoughts and feeling. That will lead to changes in behavior. One of the techniques that's often used when cognitive behavioral therapy is used in anxiety is to teach the individual how to do progressive relaxation, which as you set up a behavior which is essentially a relaxing, peaceful kind of behavior, large breaths requiring the individual to relax parts of the body. That's antithetical to anxiety and antithetical to depression, and in fact will reduce the amount of anxiety you're experiencing at that time. Okay. Again, we have the issue of what it is that is directly affecting behavior. In the cognitive behavioral model, it's the thoughts and feelings that you have about the situation, and therefore you're having an adaptive response to an inappropriate thought or experience or interpretation. And the physiologic imperative that the patient may be having at that time is not accounted for, and in fact is in part confusing the thoughts and feelings that he might be having about the situation. The same situation experienced in a painful setting is responded to and thought about differently than the situation when the patient is calm, relaxed, and not experiencing this pain. So even the same thoughts about a situation are not the stable thoughts that you would want to intervene with in a cognitive behavioral or a dialectic behavioral therapy. I don't want to go too much into dialectic behavioral because that has a lot of good research about it, but it's mostly used with a major psychiatric difficulties. We're now left with our trauma-informed approach. Okay, this approach was developed for essentially the treatment of what would be classic traumas, post-traumatic stress syndrome, or it has now been used for other than poor home environments where the child is abused. It's now seen as the kind of behavior that one might see with chronic poverty. We see the trauma in many of our kids with repeated experiences of academic failure. That's probably the most frequent of the kinds of traumatic events that our children have universally have. In reality, trauma will alter children's brain development. When you become hypervigilant to danger, you're looking for that tiger because in your past experience, it's been there and you don't want it to happen again. And so you now are hypervigilant to danger. In our kids, it's failure and shame in the academic setting. And you cannot learn when you're in this anxiety emergency mode. And you can't do that until you feel safe and secure and can let down the vigilance of danger, because the child is more comfortable now that danger will not occur or be less frequent. You don't have to look out for it. The other part is, even when you make a mistake, you do not have the repercussions that you had expected in the past. Kids do not ostracize you. They don't criticize you. The teacher doesn't look down at you. And when you feel safe that you can take a chance and fail, then you can start learning. You have reduced the freeze, fight, flight response, and which makes the child unavailable for learning. And he can now allow himself to experiment, to try something new, and therefore learn from his experiences.
And this is a process that's actually, it's a little bit late, I think, in coming to Connecticut schools. Although I guess one of the silver linings of COVID is that it has really raised awareness within education circles more generally of the impacts of trauma on children and the need to incorporate that into educational environments, incorporate that understanding. So the trauma-informed schools movement has actually been developing for decades already. And there are actually hundreds of schools and even whole school districts across the country that employ this technique within classrooms. The concept or the process behind the trauma-informed schools approach is that it always starts with very strong teacher-child relationships. And it begins in anytime there is one of these sort of aberrant moments, if you will. The first step is always to emphasize connection over correction is the phrase. So you're always looking to first reconnect from the teacher will reconnect directly with the student, reminding the student, I'm on your side. And instead of going right for, you just broke a rule, you're not supposed to do that, you didn't do your homework. Instead, it's, I can see that this is a difficult moment. Let me help you through this. So the goal is to bring them back to that sense of physiological safety as quickly as possible. Why? We want to get the blood flow back to the brain where we can have a conversation, right? So it's literally correcting a neurophysiological transition that has just happened in the child's body. And then collaborating together to identify what were the triggers, what happened just before this that led us to this moment. And then ultimately ensuring that it's not that the child doesn't experience consequences, but that the consequences are relative to the impacts on others rather than the size of the reaction. Appreciating that, if you have a child who has PTSD, let's start with the most extreme example. So there's a child who's experienced a school shooting, for instance. If a big sound happens that triggers that PTSD and they upend their chair, no one's going to look at that child and say, how dare you throw your chair, right? As soon as they understand what just happened here, that's not your first response. So the idea with the trauma-informed schools is to appreciate that there's lots of different types of trauma that are going on. And sometimes these events will be obvious and sometimes they will not. It can be very idiosyncratic child to child because of the nature of trauma. So Dr. Mattis, how does the trauma-informed schools approach align with hidden neurophysiological events in the science we started with?
What we alluded to before is the necessity to avoid the physiologic reaction of that is triggered by the patient's past traumatic event. I think it's difficult to get across the concept of safety. The child has had the experience, especially in a classroom setting, of being, and this is also true for children with specific learning disabilities, I must say. You expect to do something, you are expected to do something, you think you could do something, and you don't. This experience of failure is in itself humiliating, but then when it's picked up by the other kids, and it's picked up by the teacher, the level of that humiliation is so severe that the child never wants to experience this again. And what they do is they have this cushion. They are unwilling to do a task that even has a moderate probability of failure. And so they become very cautious. They become conservative in their willingness to do anything. And the role of the teacher in this regard is to recognize what the child is experiencing.
And that right there is where it gets tricky within
Yes.
most educational environments, when the trigger is not something that you can see like a learning activity was put in front of the child, but is a hidden neurophysiological event. Because if the educators are not trained, as our dear Dr. Mattis is, and as he has trained our staff in understanding not just sensory processing disorder, but also this myriad of other hidden neurophysiological triggers and events, then the child may be going through a physiologically almost identical process of losing availability for learning, and yet the educator in the room has been left without a toolbox to be able to identify that moment and help the student through it. Because for those kids, or for any human being, If your body, remember my sliders, right? If your body, if one of those levers or two or many of those levers is right now in a red zone, either too much or too little, then you are in a survivalist state already. So how do we help to support those kids? The trauma-informed schools approach gives us a great process for it, but it doesn't get all the way because it looks at safe as being about the sort of emotional safety, absolutely essential, but then there's a second sense of safety, which is a physiological safety. So how do we solve this problem, folks? How do we change behaviors for kids whose behaviors are driven by hidden internal events? Well, the yellow should have been your tip-off. We don't. Instead, our goal is to empower the kids to self-monitor, self-manage, and self-advocate for the ways that their bodies work. Easier said than done, absolutely. However, doable. And that is exactly why we were excited to share this with everyone today. So at Cajal Academy, no matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about academics or we're talking about a challenging behavior or we're talking about sensory dysregulation, always we start with the same three-step process, which is to say, what problem am I trying to solve? How can we move the needle for that problem? What leverage do we have available? And how can we give the child agency over this process? This really comes out of the fact that we started with, as mission-centric children who do have these hidden neurophysiological events, which may be really quite complicated and multidimensional. So why does that lead us to say that we need to be focused on giving the child agency? Quite simply, because the child is the only one who has the data that is necessary in this moment. Remember we talked about with ABA, you cannot observe from the outside that a child just had a small immunological reaction or just had a twinge of pain. Unless they make a big grimace, you won't know that from the outside. So we need to, the kids are the ones who have access to the data. We need to teach them how to read for that and how to respond to that. So if we don't start by trying to figure out what problem we're trying to solve, we're almost guaranteed to get to the wrong solution. So that's something that is a really essential part to this process. And what we do that we're finding is very effective for kids with a range of different profiles, even within the limited pilot program that we've done thus far, is that kids need a unified toolbox that they can use, whether the challenge is anxiety or that someone has triggered a negative prior memory or a sensory challenge or a medical event such as an immunological disability that goes into a flare. Why do they need a unified toolbox? Because they have a unified body-mind experience, right? The kids don't have a sensory processing challenge 2:30 p.m. on Tuesday because that's when Heather's available. They have that challenge all day, every day. They bring it everywhere they go with them. So they need to be the ones in charge of a toolbox that they can use to pick and pack across whatever the situation and their bodies present to them in the moment. So in order to do this, like I said, we're leveraging off of that trauma-informed approach because as you probably saw, as Dr. Mattis was going through the different models, that's the one that comes closest to being able to take into account the ways in which these hidden neurophysiological events affect the body, and through the body, they're learning social and emotional experiences. So we start by emphasizing the connection with the child, just like from the trauma-informed approach, and working with them to identify triggers. Except we're training our educators to take a broader starting base of what those triggers might be, start a broader set of assumptions. So instead of just looking at it as historical or emotional triggers, to appreciate there could also be sensory ones, and there could also be medical ones that are going on. So that's the first starting point. Obviously, that's something that begins with looking at extensive evaluations that have been done on this child. Those would be neuropsychological evaluations, but also understanding their medical profile at a fair degree of depth. The second step is that we coach the child to distinguish between their trigger, their reaction, and their response. Now, this is a really important distinction. And I should say, this takes time. This is not an overnight thing. This is not like a 1 hour session. Oh, look, we've got this. This whole process that we're going through right now, this is a scaffolded process. We are teaching the kids the next step as we see that they are ready for it. We are not hitting them with the whole process all at once. So the trigger versus reaction versus response. So what is that distinction? So the trigger versus reaction is probably pretty obvious. What's the difference between reaction and response? So the reaction is that autonomic response or reaction that happens that Dr. Mattis was describing. So it could be that there is a sudden flooding for the child that overwhelms them, the complete disorganization of thought, an immune reaction such as mast cell activation syndrome. It could be that there's degranulation of your mast cells, releasing neurochemicals that impact mood and critical thinking and other cognitive functions. It could be that trauma-driven freeze, fight, flight reaction. Whatever it is, it's the autonomic piece that it is not reasonable to expect the child to be able to control, at least not yet. The response, on the other hand, this is actually the part where there is a cognitive component or a motor planning component that over time the child can learn to separate. So let me give an example to really oversimplify this. So let's say you've got your kids sitting in class and they're reading a book, and unbeknownst to anybody else, a car honks in the parking lot. Now, in theory, everybody heard it, but nobody was paying attention to it. Everybody else has a perfectly good filter. Didn't faze them. This child lobbed the book across the room. So the trigger was the car horn, and the autonomic reaction was a state of dysregulation. And the response was he lobbed the book. Now, initially, when we start working with a child with this process, the answer is going to be that the reaction was, I lobbed the book. And so the work in the first phase of this process is, well, the very first phase is working to identify, oh, it was that car honking. So now in stage 2, you're saying, okay, so there was car honking. Let me teach you about what happened inside this black box that is you in that moment in which, that split-second moment in which the book became airborne, right? And getting to where we can now distinguish that reaction from that response. Initially, that is a purely intellectual distinction, but that's okay. Because if we get to where we can intellectually understand that there is a distinction between those two moments and events, then we have the opportunity to start introducing phase 3. Now we have the opportunity to introduce the concept that we can learn to drive a wedge between the reaction and the response, and that wedge is a moment of choice. So how do we get these concepts across? We literally flowchart with the kids, different scenarios. So we will, when there is a big moment, and what you have is, no, but it just isn't fair, or no, but I just couldn't help it, then to start flowcharting together. First, right, okay, all right, so that was your trigger. Okay, I get it. And where we are now is this isn't fair. Okay, so let's break down the trigger, the reaction, the response. Now let's model what were some different responses you could have done in that moment. So we could make that book airborne, or we could clap our hands, or we could give them an alternative outlet. Depending on the scenario, if it's a social conflagration that suddenly ensued, then it's more obvious. What's an alternative response? Well, I could have used my words and said I really didn't like it when you did da 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 da. We first do this as an intellectual exercise over and over and over again. Remember what I said about the cohort of kids that we're starting our program with? This is the reason that we are focused in our admissions process in seeking the group of kids who have very high fluid reasoning and verbal reasoning skills, is because this process requires those skills. Now, over time, as we continue working to develop this approach, we will be looking to broaden that and to find ways to do these protocols, to implement these protocols that doesn't rely quite so heavily on those critical thinking skills. Where we are today is that it does. So that is the reason for that criteria in our admissions. And then our whole academic programming ensues from that and is devised to really tailor to the needs of kids who do have that profile. But sticking with this moment of choice, so the next phase in all of this, where it starts to really, remember what we said, step 3 is you got to give agency to the child. Where this really starts to turn over into the child's hands, once they get good at being able to do that, is as you're identifying trigger, reaction, you start to get a sense of a very personalized set of challenges for this child. And you can then start to fashion an equally personalized set of strategies for this child. And in whichever, I sort of think of it as a spice drawer, whichever spices this child has to deal with that make them more, relatively unique relative to their peers sitting beside them in class, you need to give them a strategy that correlates for each of those spices. If your child happens to have not 1 or 2 spices, but like a whole drawer of spices, such as my child for whom we started this custom program initially, then you need to have a unified set of strategies that they can use whatever spice gets pulled out of the drawer. So in each of these cases, the purpose of the strategies, or the focus of the strategies, is to teach the child how to self-monitor, self-manage, and self-advocate, so that they begin to be in charge of what those processes are. So to give an example of how this might work on the ground, again, drawing from our pilot program and our initial work with my own son, he has mast cell activation syndrome. It's very challenging. At the time that we started doing this work with him, he would have reactions that were hidden, idiosyncratic reactions to any substance in the environment that his body had not been desensitized to. So your industrial carpet, so-and-so wore a nice new perfume today. It was everything. And it was even what fabric materials he was wearing. So his body was in a constant neurochemical soup. And Heather Edwards, really the work that became the foundation behind this whole process, was that she identified that we could use a sensory strategies toolbox and understandings of the science behind how different sensory inputs trigger different neurochemical releases in the body, to be able to correct for the neurochemical imbalances from the immunological reactions. Now that sounds crazy complicated and awesome enough if an adult does it. What was really extraordinary was that she was able to teach my son how to monitor his own neurochemical imbalances. So he wasn't able to say, hey, my dopamine's too low right now, but he was able to say, right now I feel like what I need is vestibular input. And I can get vestibular input by doing anything where my head is spinning on this axis or on this axis. Within this classroom, I could safely do that by sitting on this chair and spinning. May I please have permission to do so? And then re-regulate himself by spinning until he had corrected the neurochemical imbalance and returned to learning. And she was able to give him such facility over that process, even with this incredibly complicated hidden condition, that by age 8, he was able to go to a mainstream camp by himself without a one-to-one. And that was pretty cool, pretty transformative. Now, how do we get this information to the child, right? We actually lift the lid and tell them what's going on. So this is an absolutely essential part of our process, is that we teach the kids the science behind all of this. We teach them the science behind what dysregulation means, behind how trauma works, behind how blood flow to the brain changes the way that you are thinking and feeling. We teach them the science behind how each of their personalized strategies actually works at a neurophysiological level. When we teach them the science, some really exciting things happen. So the first is that it gives the child permission to believe that things can start to get better. Because, these kids are really smart and they're like little data engines. And when you say, oh, if you just try harder, just keep trying, honey, it'll get there. Well, they're looking back at a whole lot of data points that says, so I tried and I tried and I tried and it kept not getting better. So either you are not validating how hard I'm working, or you're really not that bright, mom and dad, because I am trying and it isn't getting better. So I don't know why you keep believing it'll get better. So when we teach them the science behind what was going on and what are we doing to change that, and what is the scientific basis for those strategies, then we give the child a reason to believe, an actual scientific basis for a growth mindset. The other thing that happens along the way is the child starts to have compassion towards themselves, because a lot of these kids, remember what we talked about, how if they've been in an environment where this understanding wasn't in place and where they therefore perhaps the gold star just kept being withheld on the days that the mast cells were reacting, right? Well, it's very easy for them to walk away having absorbed cultural messaging that they're bad or they're stupid or they just don't comply or they're obstinate or they're defiant. And when we teach them the science behind it, one of the things that I'm found saying on a regular basis is, listen, your body is just an electrical engineering set combined with a chemistry set. And usually that combination goes great. And sometimes not so much. So by teaching them that it's just science, we take the cultural and the ethical and the moral judgment out of it. So it's no longer so-and-so never follows the rule because he's not a good student or he doesn't care about the community. And instead it's, okay, gosh, chemistry set went haywire again. Let's try to regroup that one and see if we can try again. That gives compassion towards themselves. It also generates compassion towards their peers, because now they're in a position to understand why it is that so-and-so over there in the corner is always looking so morose. Now they are in a position to understand how that child's challenges and differences may be utterly different from their own, but are no morally better or worse, right? It's not culturally preferred or not preferred. It's just more science. Okay, so now we can support each other in it, and we can appreciate the work that goes into what for one child may be completely easy to comply with, for another child may be a Herculean task. And now the kids are able to appreciate and recognize it in one another. And that is really exciting. Behind all of this, you may have noticed several times in this presentation that I used the word yet. We all work hard at drilling that into one another within Cajal Academy. If ever a grown-up fails to say the word yet at the end of a sentence that relates to whether or not something is possible, then at least one child will shout out, yet! So yet turns out to be the most powerful word in the English language. Now, probably you didn't ever think about that question before, but I'm absolutely convinced of it. And the reason why is because really exciting research, including by a woman named Cheryl shows that if you teach children from the get-go that the things they can't do today, they can't do yet, to tell themselves in their head, to literally say the word yet in their head, whenever they say, I can't do this, it's not I can't do this, it's I can't do this yet. It actually makes a measurable difference in even things as basic as standardized testing scores. So she did an experiment where she went to 2 classrooms, side by side, same hallway, same school building, same curriculum. And one of the classrooms at the beginning of school was told about this concept of the word yet and said, listen, every time there's something you can't do this year, I want you to say, I can't do it yet. And the classroom next door didn't get that speech. At the end of the school year, the classroom that heard the word yet had much higher standardized testing scores. Well, that's pretty exciting, right? So part of how we implement this system and actually make it real and make it work is a system that we use that we call the YETS. Now the YETS it's a very flexible system. So it works for kids who have a very wide range of personalized strategies. As you can see, starts out in real world in-person learning, it's sticky notes. In remote learning, it's a Google form. the kids have specific strategies, each specific steps rather, individual skills that together combine towards a growth mindset on one hand, and those personalized strategies for that child on the other hand. And each time they start to show an emerging skill towards that next scaffolded level, we put a new sticky note up with something they have just succeeded in doing, but only once. So that first time that they successfully show the next level towards that learning, it goes up as a sticky note. And then as the child goes through their day, at the end of every class, they do a self-assessment of how well they assimilated and utilized their yets, the different skills. So to give you an example, every child starts out with the same yet, which is try something even though you know it will be hard, right? So at the end of every class, they're going to pull up their yets and they're going to say, did I try something even though I knew it would be hard? And if it didn't come up, they say didn't come up. And if the answer is yes, they say nailed it. And if the answer is completely not, completely ran away from it, right? We all have those moments. Then they own that. And they say, no, not this time. I didn't nail it. Now, seems like that could go haywire, right? We as adults are actually curating this process, talking through with the kids as they do their yets, so that we are there to support this process and what we found is that it allows us to actually turn the most difficult moments where there was the most difficult outcomes turn into the ones where the kids end up feeling most empowered, because they see in the process of going through the yets, they're checking off the earlier skills that used to feel impossible that now they're nailing. And so they become visibly aware of their own progress at all times. You will notice that this is very different from saying, did you get a 96% or a 98% or a 70%? We're not looking at what was your performance outcome. Now, when it comes to our academic work, yes, by all means, we have standards-based academics, we have assessments in place. But what we're trying to do as what we believe is the most powerful skill set we can give children to have agency over their own outcomes is to give them that growth mindset, an understanding of concretely what does it mean, and their own unified toolbox of personalized strategies that they can use to be able to self-monitor, self-manage, and self-regulate. Because I'm sure that every parent on this call feels the same way that I do, which is that we want our children to be able to go out into this world independently and go after whatever dream is the right dream for them. And we do not plan to pack ourselves in the trunk of the car. So if we want our children to be able to do that, we need them to have agency over this process. What we found that is perhaps even more exciting is that when we do that, doing this requires that you do it on a fully environmental basis. You can't do this for one child within a classroom in which the other children are not experiencing that. And a really key piece of how the progress happens is what happens between children. It's when you see the kids understand each other's challenges and start to advocate for each other. No, hold on. Don't talk about that curriculum that way because it's going to trigger, he's got a trigger on that. Weren't you paying attention, teacher? That's an awesome moment. And to see them celebrate each other's victories, that then becomes the fuel that gives each of them the courage. So one of the things that that happens in our classroom is we teach all of the kids about, for instance, trauma triggers. And we had a child join our program who had a real trauma trigger around writing. And he had an extraordinary vocabulary. If you even said the word writing, he would be under the desk, which was really tragic to see. And so we all made a game of anytime somebody had a trigger, heard a trigger word, then they would shout out EPO, meaning emergency protocol override, because their brain had just gone into emergency protocols, that trauma brain. And instead of that child slinking down and trying to hide that from their peers, it became a laugh moment. Someone shouts EPO and everybody says EPO! And then suddenly, instead of being alone with it, they had peer support. So here's my lad who inspired all this. I do have two, but here's the one who's got us all started on all this. And it really can be transformative. before we started this, when my son came out of mainstream environments where he had a range of other approaches, he was really convinced that all of those challenges that he had that were just hidden to everybody else made him bad. And he kind of leaned into that a little bit, right? Like, I'm a tough kid because nobody gets me anyway. We've all seen Grease, right? What does Zuko do, right? So when we started explaining all of this and particularly teaching him the science behind what was happening, it just utterly transformed his sense of self. And I'm very pleased to say that he now has a very intact and whole sense of identity that has space for his differences. And that, I think, is really the goal that we would like to be able to do for all children, and what led our team to say we can't keep this to ourselves, and we really do want to open this up to other families. But we also, more than that, we would like to eventually, really be doing more and more educational workshops like this one today, which is our first community educational workshop, to share these techniques with others, and hopefully have an impact beyond our walls. Now, we took time to go through what were some of the limitations of other approaches that came before that we are building on. I think it's important that we share limitations of our own approach. The first thing to keep in mind is there is no one approach, not ours, not anybody else's. The point is you have to start with what are the problems that you're trying to solve. And those problems are different for different children. They're different for different communities, they're different for different environments. It's essential to appreciate sometimes you're going to need to pull an ABA piece out of the hat because actually right now what I'm dealing with is a goal-oriented behavior. And another time, well, we need these neuro approach because right now what we're dealing with is a neurophysiologically driven behavior. It's getting to where everybody and all the adults in the room are trained in all of these different pick and pack approaches and are able to then implement them in real time. So limitations of our approach, we just talked about some really educated grown-ups in the room, a bunch of them. Today, the way that we implement this at Cajal is that we have a team meeting every week where all of our educators and all of our therapists meet together, discuss every child, discuss the dynamics among the children, discuss what's coming up in the curriculum, and are doing a constant cross-pollination of information and ideas and understandings from all of these different lenses of what might be going on for the child. And that is really essential. Over time, one of the things that we are looking at already is there maybe there's a new kind of a skill set or a new kind of a function that needs to be present in a classroom, who is a person who really does house this expertise, integrating across sensory, trauma, learning differences, neurophysiological differences. So how do you make this something scalable? A second is that it requires specializing the environment. Now, notice I didn't say it requires a specialized environment. It means specializing your environment. It doesn't work to have one child on a trauma-informed approach within a consequentialist classroom because it's not going to feel safe to that child. The approach that we're developing here, we really find that that peer interaction, that community piece of it, is such a powerful lever. So bringing it to a whole environment is really beneficial. And then third is that currently, as I said before, our protocols do rely on we're flow charting. It's very high fluid reasoning and verbal reasoning skills. Over time, we will be looking to expand the sort of the range for which that we're able to make this process work. And as we do so, frankly, we'll look at probably adjustments in our cohort as well. We are all very strong believers in mainstream education. We just want to make sure that the expertise is there in the room to be able to really appreciate and meet the needs of each of the kids walking in the door, as everybody does. So, as I said before, we're hoping that this is just the beginning of being able to bring a new approach that can help a lot of kids in a lot of settings. And with that, I would like to say thank you to everyone for hanging in there with us for this long and at times in-depth conversation. We have a couple more minutes here. If anybody has a question that they'd like to ask, either of Dr. Mattis or myself, I'm afraid Heather had to jump off to treat more kids. We are happy to answer any questions.
Does the trauma-based approach require you to identify the specific trauma that triggered this response? You know, why maybe not like the example of writing causes him to tie her to the desk, but what caused that in the first place?
I think that I have two answers for that. It is not, the most obvious is that one will not have to have the child in treatment for 2 years in order to understand what was the hidden trauma to which he has repressed and which he's now responding to. What we're dealing with is the child's behavior and the kinds of behavior that one has with past experience of trauma are really the mechanism that they use to save themselves from experiencing that again. So what we can see the behaviors that are used to avoid the association with the past experience. And eventually we get a good idea of what the specific nature of that experience had been. But this is not an uncovering therapy. What we want to do is have the child recognize the behaviors that they're using to avoid this experience and be able to have control over that and use it to his advantage. So it would be helpful to know what the specific event was, but most of the time we don't have that. Most of the time it takes some time to get a good feel for what the specific trauma was.
And just to build on what Dr. Mattis just said, one of the things, particularly with specifically academic fears and traumas, and looking again even more specifically for kids who have complex learning profiles where you may have very high outlying strengths coupled with some average skills or some outlying weaknesses. For these kids, sort of the function of the trauma or the creation of the trauma may just come from the fact that they're walking through a world and a curriculum that presumes even synchronous development across cognitive skills, and that's simply not factual for them. And so they're going through school and this is easy, this is boring, this is easy, this is boring. Oh my gosh, I have no idea how to do that. I suddenly feel like an idiot. And that sudden like 2x4 between the eyes, that is what becomes the trauma. So for a child who has that experience, those personalized strategies that we talked about still come into play. Those personalized strategies would include helping the child to understand, again, by sharing the science, here's what your profile looks like. We are not, it's not like there's one spectrum and kids sit on it. There's a myriad spectra with respect to visual processing and working memory and fluid reasoning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you're like at the intersection of a whole bunch of different strings, right? So there are things that are going to be super duper easy for you. And there are things that are going to feel to you inordinately hard. And now let's teach you how to take a task and break that down and understand all of the bundled cognitive skills that go into that one task. And now you have a predictive lens that you can use in advance to look at something and say, oh, okay, writing, right. So that's going to call on creativity where I rock. That's going to call on handwriting where I roll. And that's going to call on organization of thought where I want to cower under my desk. So now I know how to brace myself. Now I know how to specifically articulate I need help, and therefore how to start to overcome those fears and have the courage to try that next writing assignment instead of just saying, yeah, I don't write. It's just not something that I do. So that is an example of where we never got to the moment of, oh, you know, there was once in 7th grade and I turned in this paper and I got an F, but rather we are giving them the toolbox to be able to work with the underlying process that made it traumatic. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. Another question sort of related is it always, I mean, does this technique depend on the gating factor always being somewhat of a sort of a fight or flight response, or could it be something else like some sort of initiation loop or some sort of something that where the kid just gets stuck in his mind that's not necessarily a physiological response. Do you know what I mean?
Well, what you're describing is a flooding phenomena where you either have a lot of thoughts that you can't get a handle, or you have no thought, which is actually pretty scary for many kids. But those are phenomena that occur as a function of anxiety, and which is essentially our fear reaction. So while the thing that you described, which is the getting stuck, is actually the freeze. You have when you're just uncertain as to what you're to do next, or you don't want to do anything because anything you can do is going to be wrong at that point, and there's no sense trying, and you just stop at that point. So it's difficult for me to look at behavior that is not consistent with getting along and doing well in the world, and not see this as behavior that is being triggered by something that the child is actually adapting to. But when you look at it from the social situation, it's not adaptive to what's going on in the environment. We adapt to everything that's going on. That's how we survive as a species. And so when the kid is doing something, you have to understand, or you have to try to understand and allow the child to understand, why is he doing that at this time? What's in it for him? What's the purpose for himself when he has this kind of behavior? I would then, that would be a point in which one might want to ask the child, what were you experiencing when that happened? What do you think triggered that? What are you afraid of? Would be the kind of questions I might ask at that point. And sometimes the kid doesn't know. And it's because he hasn't even thought about that as a question. But as it comes up a number of times, the child, we're dealing with children who are intellectually very curious and bright, which is one of the limitations of this program. But it's what we use extensively in order to allow the child to explore what the antecedents were, what was the cause, and what it was his goal when he did what he did at that time. Well, that's a long answer. I'm not quite sure it answered your question. I learned something from it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I guess these initiation loops that I was describing actually does fit into the freeze.
Yeah.
Bit of the autonomic reaction that you were talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Initiation is often of many things is often seen as an executive process in which you have to get off the dime in order to get started on something. But it's such a primitive process that in order to, you have to think something that's really serious going on if the child can't start to do something. But others might see this from a neuropsychological point of view as an executive process where the decision making is kind of stopped and the child is not able to move on in thought. That's from a neuropsychological point, it's interesting, but it doesn't lead to kind of interventions that would be helpful where the approach does.
We have just a couple more minutes. Are there any other questions anybody wants to ask in this forum? Or if not, you're welcome to reach out to me or to Dr. Mattis. It's probably easiest if you send a message to me. I'm Cheryl at cajalacademy.org, and I'm happy to help shepherd questions to Dr. Mattis as well. If anyone else has a question, if you want to put a video on or pop it in a chat. And if not, I think we might sign off for today. So thank you to everyone for joining us for this, our first community educational workshop, and we're hoping it will be the first of many because we really are very passionate as a team about working to apply modern neuroscientific understandings to empower kids in new and different ways, and then to share that because really we want to see all kids benefit from this, from the work that we're doing, and from the science. And the problem is that it's complicated because it's new science, and so that's where having Dr. Mattis on our team, having Heather Edwards on our team, and others, we'll be doing other programs. Please, if you stay attuned to our newsletter and make sure it doesn't land in your promotions folder or your spam folder. We'll be having workshops in the future in things such as how we're using neuroplasticity to build up low-lying cognitive skills to close some of those gaps that I was talking about that can make learning challenges so very difficult. And other aspects of our programming. We'll also probably be doing one on our unique approach to integrating therapeutic skills and programming into project-based learning together with standards-based academics. So yes, I see questions in the chat about recording. I have been recording and my fingers are crossed that will come out well. In the past, I've had that go brilliantly, and I've had that go complete conflagration, and I still don't understand the difference between the two. So we're hoping that today's recording will have come through just fine. And if that's the case, then if you send me an email, I'm happy to get the recording out to you. And in fact, we're hoping to be able to post it to our website as well. If there are no other questions, I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Mattis for all your time today and sharing your expertise. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Hope you had your lunches behind your black box video screens there. I also, if anybody has any feedback for us, we would love to hear it. And that includes feedback on things like, boy, lunch is a miserable time. Please don't do that again. Really, we're open to all suggestions. Thanks to everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.